Good morning. My name is Nancy Gariché. I am a senior security analyst for the Government of Canada. I'm part of the security assessment and authorization team of my department, and I'm delighted to be here. Before I start, I would like to say a quick thank you to the organizing team for moving forward with the event in its virtual format. So let's get started. The presentation I have for you today is called Security Challenges in the Cloud. It's a lightning talk. Let me share with you the agenda. So again, it's a lightning talk. It's an introduction to cloud security. My game plan is to tell you why I think cloud security is important for you as a tech maker. Then I'll define what security practitioner mean by security and what it should also mean to you. Then we'll discuss a bit of definition and concept about cloud, the cloud landscape. And I'll finish the presentation with a few good practices that you can implement in your environment to secure your environment. I hope that sounds good. So let's move on. So as a tech maker, as a developer, why you should care? Well, cloud and DevOps are changing the role of developers. So if you're not familiar with DevOps, there are a lot of definition out there, but I think they would all agree that it's in short, it's a culture shift that breaks down barriers between developers and operations. They now have to work together, and sometimes in smaller teams, they're actually the same person. In the past, how it would work, and sometimes still does work like that, developers were mainly expected to code and create software, and they would look at operation and security as somebody else's problem, and so they didn't put an effort to build their software with good operation and security in mind from the get-go. But with the adoption of a concept of culture like DevOps, then the developers now play a central role, and they're now accountable not only for the quality of their software, but quality also means good operation and taking care of security issues as well. So as a tech maker, as a developer, I think it's important for you to care about the environment that you're now responsible for. Okay, so let's define security. If I ask someone who's not a security practitioner what is security, they usually give me a definition that's closer to confidentiality. And they're right. Confidentiality is you don't want to give access to somebody who's not authorized to your data, right? But that's only one part of security. Security is actually, as you can see, the CIA triad has three parts. C is for confidentiality, I is for integrity, and A is for availability. And when I talk about integrity, I mean that we want our data and system to be accurate, to remain accurate. And if someone doesn't have the authorization to change it or delete it, they shouldn't be able to. And even if someone has access to it and has the right to delete or modify data or a system, they should be able to revert back their changes if they realize they made a mistake. So that's integrity. Then there's availability. I think, as the name says, you want your system to be available when you need it. What is important? Yes, we now know that security has three parts: the C, I, and A. But I also want you to know that each have a rating. Not all data have the same confidentiality rating, the same integrity rating, the same availability rating. You do not protect your publicly available information the same way that you protect your banking information. So the CIA triad or the rating of the CIA for your system and your data is a really good tool for you to know how to prioritize and how to know how much effort and resources to invest into protecting your environment, and also how to design your environment based on the rating of your data. Okay, so we're moving on with the cloud definition and concept. So in short, cloud computing describes the use of hardware and software resources that are delivered over the internet. But the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, defines cloud computing with 5 characteristics. So let's go through them quickly. First, on demand. When you log into your AWS, Azure, or GCP console, you can provision a VM on your own. You can provision resources on your own. You have access to your account, and you can do that without interacting with anyone. So it's definitely a on-demand self-service offering. Then there's broad network access. That means that you can have access to your cloud environment, not only through your mobile phone, through your laptop, to your computer, to your tablet, and all that over usually the internet. A third characteristic that is quite important from a security perspective is resource pooling, and it goes hand in hand with multi-tenancy. Basically, especially for the public cloud, we are sharing the infrastructure with other tenants, right? So it's like living in the same apartment building, but you want to protect the content of your apartment, and you want to make sure that your neighbors cannot see what's inside your apartment. So it's the same with multi-tenancy in the cloud. So we always want to make sure that we protect your data enough and that nobody else in that environment has access to our data. Next is rapid elasticity and scalability. That's a very good advantage of the cloud. A good example for that is an e-commerce website that maybe is selling things, especially for the holiday season. Well, maybe for the rest of the year, they're not very busy, so they don't need a big infrastructure, so they don't need to provision a lot of resources the rest of the year, but they can scale up for their busy season and scale down for their lower season. So you can scale automatically up or down depending on your needs. It's kind of linked to the fifth and final characteristic, which is measured service, where it basically means that you pay for what you use, a bit like your electricity bill. The more you use, the more you pay. So those are the 5 characteristics of cloud computing according to NIST. So now that we combine both cloud, we define security. So cloud security consists of a set of policies, controls, procedures, and technologies that work together to protect your confidentiality, integrity, and availability of cloud-based system, data, and infrastructure. So as you can see on the slide, there's different things that you can put in place. And yes, it's technology that can do access control, authentication, segmentation, configuration hardening, but it also needs to be supported by policies and procedures. So technology is only one part of cloud security. So all type of activities that you do to protect your environment that is cloud-based is cloud security. There are different offerings for cloud computing, and it usually falls in one of these 3 categories: either infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, or software as a service. I want to show you this pizza as a service. So basically, that's the most famous analogy. I did not come up with this. It's a classic. And it's an analogy to basically make you understand that as a cloud service provider and as a cloud consumer, you have responsibility and the provider has responsibility. So if we do the analogy with the pizza, is that you can get pizza different ways. You can bake it yourself and get all the ingredients, everything you need at home, and that you are in charge of everything. And that is similar to a traditional IT system that is on premises. But you can also go to a restaurant, make a reservation, and just show up with your friends and have a pizza party there. And the restaurant is basically almost responsible for everything. And that is similar to software as a service, where they provide the infrastructure, they provide the platform and everything, and you just have to bring in your data. But there are also offerings in between, where if we talk pizza again, you might want to select your toppings for your pizza, but you don't care about about baking your own dough or making your own dough. So you would buy the dough, but still use your own toppings for your pizzas. So the whole point of this analogy is to make you understand that sometimes things are your responsibility and sometimes things are the vendor's responsibility. And you also have more control. The more responsibility you have, the more control you have on your environment or your pizza. So let's go see the next slide. So we need to make sure that we understand the shared responsibility model, because sometimes the misconception is that once you move to the cloud, you're relieved of your responsibility and everything is for the cloud provider to do. But the shared responsibility model is important to pay. It's important to pay attention to it, to understand what is your responsibility. And this came about because people were assuming that the cloud they were delegating everything to the cloud and expecting the cloud provider to take care of everything. That resulted in quite a bit of incidents where many examples of security breaches caused by misconfiguration of cloud services. And again, on the slide, it says, according to Gartner analysis, by 2020, 80% of cloud breaches will be due to customer misconfiguration, mismanaged credential, or insider theft, not cloud provider vulnerability. So despite the percentage, what they're trying to say here is that usually the cloud service provider does their do their job, right? And it's the client, the consumer, that usually is not aware of their responsibility or doesn't have control of what they should be responsible for, and mistakes are made, misconfigurations are made, and that lead to data breaches. So that's the number one reason for data breaches in cloud environment. So let's move on to the second part, which is good practices in the cloud. So the cloud and legacy system, traditional IT, are very similar there, but there are a few things that you can do differently in the cloud, that different challenges that are in the cloud, and I want us to talk a little bit about that. So the 4 things that we'll talk about is identity and access management, data asset management and protection, logging, monitoring, and incident response, and finally, infrastructure and policy as code. So first, identity and access management. So IAM is supremely important in cloud environments. Why? Because we no longer have a perimeter. Traditionally, in data centers, in traditional IT, you would have a data center and create a perimeter around it with firewalls, and you would trust everything that is inside and nothing that is outside. But with cloud, this perimeter does not exist anymore. So we really need to rely on identity and access management and re-identify everything, authenticate everything, and revalidate every time we give access to a resource. So identity and access management is really crucial, especially in the cloud environment. Also, because there are multiple cloud systems and services, you want to be able to manage your identities centrally. You want centralized authentication, centralized authorization systems, so that we don't have multiple identities for different services. So from the get-go, you want to integrate cloud-based identity management solutions with enterprise security from the outset. You don't want this to be an afterthought. I think that's it. Next, I want to talk about data asset management and protection. A bit as I've mentioned at the beginning of the presentation about the CIA, you need to know what you have before you start devising a cloud security strategy. What is your data? How sensitive is it? What are the requirements? And then you can build an architecture, a strategy to protect your data. And one of the good practices that you can implement is tagging, and having a tagging dictionary in your organization that everybody adheres to identify your data, so that your cloud environment is able to understand what is permitted or not. For example, you can allow more sensitive information to only live within Canada. And if somebody in that environment tries to deploy data in another region, in the USA, in another country, then it won't allow it because of the tagging and also other configuration. But when you tag your data accordingly, you can manage your environment way better. And one of the way to protect your data is also encryption. You can encrypt your data in flight. When it goes between system, when it's the most vulnerable, but you can also encrypt your data at rest. And that's important, as we saw in the characteristic of the cloud, that your data lives in on the same infrastructure, sometimes on the same server, on the same rack as other tenants. So if your data is encrypted, then it's a non-issue. It shouldn't really matter who else is next to you, because they do not have access. You've put a lock on your data, so they cannot access your data even if they're next to it. However, the danger, encryption is great, but there's also a danger to encryption. When you encrypt your data, you're basically putting a lock on it. And if you put a lock on it and you have multiple locks, what becomes hard to manage is key management, because if you lose the key, you lose access to your data. If you don't want to lose the key and you make it too easily accessible and you don't protect it properly, well, it affects the confidentiality of your data. You don't want just anybody. It's like locking your door and then putting the key on the doormat. Then that's not really protecting your house. So the same with encryption. So if you want your encryption to be valuable, you then automatically need to have a great key management system. And most of the time, your cloud service provider, the big three, especially for infrastructure as a service, they have their own offering to help you manage your keys. What is important is you might want to decide to keep your keys, or let the cloud provider manage your key. It depends on the amount of control that you want, because if your cloud provider manages your key, it definitely has access to your data. But if you want to protect, if there's a trust issue between yourself and the cloud provider, and you want to encrypt your data before you send it there, then you should manage your own key. So there are different offering and different ways that you can configure your encryption and key management to give you more control. But again, I would advise that as much as it protects your data, it is also a risk to the availability of your data. If you lose the key to the keys to something that is encrypted, you no longer have access to it. So therefore, it's almost as if you deleted it. Okay, let's move on to logging, monitoring, and incident response. Yeah, that's the big one. So what we see a lot is environments that log but do not monitor. I compare that to having a fire alarm with a mute button on it. That by design should not exist, right? You should never be able to mute your fire alarm because you don't want to hear removing the batteries. If you have all that data, you need to know what's going on. You need to be looking at it to be able to detect what is going on. And a good way, another practice that you should you should adopt is to understand your environment well enough to define what you think should happen and what should not happen, and create rules about things that should not occur in your environment. And if these events occur, then to alert you so that somebody says can react to that event. Okay, so for example, something quite easy. You should never use the root account of your cloud environment. Well, if you have a rule in your logs that's in your monitoring that says if the root account logs in or is used, alert me, that's a good thing. So any type of activities that you don't want to see in your environment, that shouldn't happen in your environment, you should have an alarm for. And not only should you have an alarm, when you create an alert for something that should not happen, you should also have a playbook, an incident response plan on what to do if it actually occurs. And that in advance, not when it happens. So when this occurs, what am I supposed to do? And how do I communicate? And is it only internally within my organization, or do I have to contact the cloud service provider? And do I know how to contact them? And do I know what's my agreement with my cloud service provider? So logging, monitoring, and having an incident response plan are good habits to have, not only in traditional IT, but also in the cloud. And you have normally in your environment services by default in your environment to do your logging and to monitor the services that you have, that you've provisioned. Okay. And finally, the last one is infrastructure and policy as code. That is a great change that is going on right now. Well, infrastructure as code has been around for a bit now, but now we see policy as code as well showing up a bit more. What we mean by that is, if you log into your AWS, Azure, GCP console, you can click away and provision what you want. And it may work for 1, 2, 3, 5 resources, but when you're managing an environment, it's really easy to make mistake and not click on the right configuration, and to not configure things correctly. But if you can procure your environments by coding your environments, then that you have the same benefit than you do with your source code. So basically, there's version control. You can have, you can test your infrastructure as code and make sure that there's no mistake that are implemented even before that is deployed. That's for infrastructure. And policy, what is great about policy is that you can define your policy requirement, not only what you don't want to happen specific to your environment, but sometimes what is required by the law. So if you're with PCI DSS and you're processing credit card information, there are rules that you need to follow. If you codified your policy, then you make sure that your environment does follow those rules, and that you're notified if that doesn't happen. So that's also a good practice. So this was the final best practice that I had for you for cloud security to secure your environment. And I hope that was useful. And for my last slide, I have my contact information. I am Nancy Gariché on LinkedIn, and I am Nancy G Tweet on Twitter. So have a great conference, and I think I'll be available for questions if you have any. Take care. Thank you.